Hey guys, it's Dean. Welcome to the Better Man podcast. Today's episode is a solo episode, and I'm going to talk about something that comes up a lot in the Better Man podcast, and that is the idea of masculinity. So, I've titled this solo podcast The State of Masculinity in 2023. I kind of want to go through some of the discussions that are happening right now. I want to try and be somewhat objective in presenting the different ideas that are put forward. I also want to share some of my own thoughts and try to create some dialogue around a topic that is not safe to talk about in this current climate. So I think this is something that's important for me. And I know that just because of how Manful Yoga developed, if I am interested in something, I know that somebody else is going to be interested in something. You have to understand that for the sake of this solo podcast, I'm coming at this from the perspective of a cisgender, white, heterosexual male, married with two kids. So, cisgender meaning I identify as either male or female and not transgender. So, I'm thinking about much of this in terms of man and women. That is a lot of the conversations that I have on this podcast. So this is the perspective that I'm most able to empathize with and to see it from. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about this in when it comes to my own personal views. I'm also going to share, what some of the other perspectives could be. Someone coming at this from the LGBTQIA plus community, someone who doesn't care about whether or not they are being masculine. Our web developer, in his own words, is incredibly gay, and he's not going to listen to this podcast and think that he's going to start behaving in a way that's more masculine because he doesn't care. He's happy with how he acts. He's happy with how he behaves. He's living his life in accordance with his values. And this isn't something that he's going to listen to and start changing what he does. For me personally, I do believe in having a kind of certain set of standards for myself as a man who values masculinity. And I want to strive for a healthy, positive expression of that. I'm interested in learning and having conversations about what does that mean. It's important to me. And that doesn't mean that I'm imposing this on you. That doesn't mean that I'm evaluating your own worth of a man based on the amount of masculinity that you choose to utilize or not utilize. I think that's an important thing to mention is that, first off, the value of a man is not determined based on how masculine he is. That's just you can be really masculine or you can be not masculine. It doesn't change your value as a man. The only important thing for that would be how you evaluate yourself, right? We're not imposing these standards on somebody else. We're just kind of figuring out for ourselves what works best for me. And if I am a biological man and I identify as a man, then it might be helpful for me to know what are traditionally masculine behaviors. But we also want to bring up the idea that some traditional masculine behaviors are no longer serving us in this day and age. So thinking about, okay, this has worked in the past, but now thinking about, okay, is this still working for us? I think that's important conversation to have. It's a lot of the reason why I started the Better Man podcast, because I looked around and I saw expressions of masculinity and I looked at ideas of what it means to be a man, and I thought, hey, that doesn't make sense. Like, for let's think about stereotypes for men and what makes them good or bad, so to speak, right? So, a man should be able to build a house, to frame a deck, to hang a TV, to do all these things with his hands. I'm not a handyman. I can do something to some extent, but like I'm not going to try and do something that I think a carpenter should be doing. And there's a stereotypical idea that men should be able to build things, right? So, that's just one example, but something that exists in all of our lives would be, the idea that men don't cry and men don't show emotions. And I know that in order to be healthy, both physically and emotionally, because the two affect one another, that we do need to be emotional sometimes. We do need to express ourselves. We need to acknowledge our own feelings. So I think that there are some things that we can do when it comes to evaluating traditional masculinity, that we can look at that and say, okay, maybe this worked, however long ago this worked, this was good because it helped show, there was a reason for it. It helped to provide stability, it helped provide reassurance if we did not express our own worries. If we showed, hey, we're confident and we know that we think that we're safe and we're going to convey that to our tribe or whatever it was, then that was helpful at a time. I think it's the same way that we learn certain behaviors. You could compare this to how we learn certain behaviors as kids. We learn certain protective behaviors. We've talked about this a lot on this podcast, but we learn certain behaviors that help to protect us emotionally, maybe physically. And we continue those behaviors into adulthood, even though they aren't serving us anymore. And it takes us actually being consciously addressing some of these behaviors that we subconsciously developed in response to the need to protect ourselves. And it takes, bringing these things up and looking at them critically. And that's kind of what we're doing right now. And that's why I wanted to bring this up in a solo podcast, is to kind of encourage dialogue about what is masculinity. If we're interested in this, how should we, how can we evaluate ourselves? If you want to evaluate yourselves in this way, how can we evaluate ourselves as men? How does masculinity figure into that? So, and I want to be able to talk about this issue. I don't want to not talk about it, because it's something that I do talk about and something that I personally value and I think about a lot. And instead of just shouting over the other person or, sharing a meme with them, I'd like to actually have a conversation and try to understand where the other person is coming from and try to create some common ground. So yeah, I think that's where I'm coming at from this. I actually did have a discussion with the Manflow Yoga team about this in our weekly meeting last week, because I wanted to make sure that I did this in a way that was respectful. I didn't want people to hear this and cancel me, or I don't know. I wanted to be able to do this in a way that was respectful. I wanted to account for multiple perspectives. And I wanted to do it in accordance with, the values of this show, of this podcast, and my own personal values, which has a huge impact on this podcast. Hey guys, I want to give a quick shout out to our featured brand this week, Chubbies. They are giving 20% savings when you use the link in the show notes to shop at chubbies.com. This is the brand that I have personally been using since 2011. Back then, they only did casual shorts, which I loved. And then they started making swimsuits. From there, they started making workout shorts. Now they make t-shirts as well. I am a fan of all of them. I love the casual shorts because they are as free moving as workout shorts. I can actually squat down. I can play around in them. I can work out in them. The swimsuits are super fun. They get a lot of attention whenever I wear them out in public. And the workout shorts are really fun, and they're comfortable and effective for workouts as well. So again, I hope you can take me up on this offer. Use that link in the show notes for 20% savings, and skies out, thighs out. With all that being said, let's get into this. So first off, I think, I mentioned this in the intro, but your masculinity does not determine your worth as a man. And I think a problem is if we do use that as a barometer to kind of rate men or to evaluate their effectiveness of men. If we're saying, okay, the more masculine behaviors you do, the more of a man you are, which is not true. You're a man if you say you're a man. That's period and stop, right? But you might actually be surprised to learn what the definition of masculine is. So I looked it up because I'm like, what does masculinity actually mean? And all it really means is behaviors that are traditionally associated with men. So there's not really a lot to go on with that. So masculinity is then things that we traditionally associate with men. I have a little graphic that I'm going to refer to here. So things that are typically masculine or traditionally masculine, and they're stereotypes, but aggressive, independent, not easily influenced, dominant, active, not easily hurt emotionally, decisive, not very talkative, tough, less sensitive to others' feelings, not very desirous of security. They probably already feel secure, doesn't cry, logical, not emotional, analytical, blunt, and not nurturing. So these are all, these are all things that are traditionally masculine. And it's not really up for debate. Those are things that are traditionally considered masculine. That doesn't mean that we need to take those into the future, or that that's the only way that men can behave. Because if you were a man that only did that, you would be probably a very emotionally disturbed man. So but that is what masculinity is. It's behaviors that are traditionally associated with men. So some behaviors could be considered masculine, some could be considered neutral, and some are feminine. And later in this episode, I'm actually going to question: do we even, what's the value of assigning behaviors as masculine or feminine? There's some other ideas that might make more sense, because again, I think the implication is that if you're a man, you want to be manly, that you have to be manly all the time, or you're less of a man. Or if you're a woman, then you should be womanly and you should be feminine all the time. And if you act masculine, then you're less of a woman. And that's not true, because again, men and women both do feminine or masculine things. So, yeah, I think that's important, an important point to bring up. The other thing that I realized as I was thinking about this was I personally know nothing about masculinity. Everything that I've learned has been subconsciously gleaned through my own experiences or through kind of pop culture. And a lot of those things are negative behaviors. A lot of those things would fall into the category of what I would call toxic masculinity. And we'll talk about that a little bit as well in this episode. So I have my assumptions about what masculinity is, but I never sat down with a tribal elder to tell me what it means to be a man. So I never went through some sort of I never went through some sort of process like that. I think the closest thing for me for that was my experience with sports, and being tough in sports, being aggressive, being surrounded by other men, and the sport that I played was a pretty violent game, right? It was lacrosse. So we're beating people with sticks, we're checking people, we're pushing people, and we're doing it somewhat respectfully. Most of the time, it's respectful. Sometimes you have games where it's where you get chippy, but for the most part, it's done in a way that is a safe environment. Not to say that I've not had injuries, but anyways, I'm getting a point here. The point is that for me, a lot of my ideas about masculinity develop subconsciously, or also through the activities in which I was with other men predominantly. Um, so yeah, that is all to say that I know nothing about masculinity, and I think that's probably where most people are. We probably don't think a lot about masculinity. We don't critically think about it. And now that I'm doing this podcast, I'm like, oh wow, okay, I do want to explore this a little bit more. What does it mean to be masculine, and how do we do that in a way that is better suited toward our day, toward this year, toward 2023, as opposed to 50 years ago, um, as opposed to what we did 50 years ago, as opposed to what we traditionally did. What are some new ways to look at how to be masculine? So we couldn't do this without bringing up the idea of toxic masculinity. So we're realizing that there are a lot of behaviors that are harmful. There are a lot of things that are done and kind of explained away as, oh, that's just men being men, when really that's just an asshole being an asshole, right? So I think it's a good thing that we brought up this idea, that we're pointing out behavior and saying like, no, that's not being masculine. You're being an asshole. And I saw something the other day where somebody said toxic masculinity is what happens in the absence of masculinity. And I thought that was an interesting idea, because, I'd like to imagine that masculinity is something comforting. This is a terrible analogy, but I like to think of it as a warm weighted blanket that's slowly bringing you to where you need to go. Providing reassurance along the way, but at the same time, hey, we're going here, we're going to get there. And that's just, a random, a random analogy that I had. But I think that it's a fair point that I think it's a fair point when we say that masculinity can be toxic or it can be positive. And I think that what's happening with the emergence of toxic masculinity and questioning traditional masculine behaviors is that we are now suspicious of something that is all male. We think that that's toxically masculine because it's all male, because there's no feminine, or there's no woman involved. Or we're also instead of we're also looking at traditionally masculine behaviors, and instead of picking out which ones we should keep, which ones we should throw away, and maybe which ones we should kind of make more neutral, we're looking at it and saying, oh, this was traditionally masculine. Traditional masculinity is toxic, so now we're going to do the opposite of that. And I don't think that's the right way to do it either. I think about I was raised in a house where I had a very masculine mom. She was masculine because that was what she needed to do in order to be successful with her career, and that was what she needed to do to be safe. Um, so for her, like, it makes sense that she was masculine, and she taught me that other women are masculine too, and that they didn't need my help, and they didn't need me to protect them, and they didn't need me to make decisions for them. So these are all things that are, while a lot of those things are, I think, are somewhat valid. um it's it doesn't mean that women never want me to make the decision, or women never want me to be able to protect them. So I think for me, it would have been more helpful for me to not just do the complete opposite, but to try and integrate the two. And that's kind of what I want to do. That's kind of why I'm doing this solo episode. I want to bring up, hey, yes, toxic masculinity is bad. There are certain expressions of traditional masculinity that we should not be doing anymore. At the same time, we shouldn't get rid of all traditional masculinity, because there are some things in it that are helpful. And I think it's also, the other point that kind of comes up here is that there's no reason why a woman can't do masculine behaviors. And it's ultimately up to you, right? It's up to you. It's not you imposing, or other people imposing, how feminine you are or how masculine you are. It's ultimately up to you to figure out what works best for you. So I, I I think the issue is when that's imposed on other people, when we evaluate people, when we evaluate their worth based on how masculine they are or how feminine they are. That's the issue. So for me, I'm looking at traditionally masculine behaviors that I think are no longer serving us. So that's a big idea behind the Better Man podcast. It's a huge reason why I started the Better Man podcast, is to figure out how can we be more effective as men in a way that is kinder to ourselves in a lot of ways. I think that traditional masculinity, I think that it's important to be tough. I think it's important to have grit. I think it's important to to be relentless in certain regards. But I think that we can also do that in a way that is kinder to ourselves. I think that we can do hard things while at the same time acknowledging to ourselves, this is hard. This is hard to do. And talking to people around you and saying, this is hard. I'm struggling with this. Because I think that's actually going to help us be more successful. I'm interested in, how do I be more successful, and how do I do so in a way that's healthier for me? So I think that I think that I think that we can do things in a way that is better for ourselves and also for better people. And so other things that I want to question with traditional masculinity: men don't cry. If you don't cry, um, you're going to have some pent up emotions. I realized a few years ago that you cannot experience the extreme ranges of motion if you choose to disregard one of them. So if you don't let yourself feel sad, you're going to struggle with allowing yourself to feel happy. You don't get to choose one or the other. Um, so, so not crying, not showing emotions. This is something that is I think it can be helpful in providing stability when necessary, but restricting it all the time and not expressing that, I think that is harmful for us. So Um, I also think that the idea that men don't ask for help is something that we should not be doing, or men should do everything themselves. Or again, a man should be able to build his own deck. I am for sure getting on the phone and calling somebody to build that deck. I'm not going to attempt to do that myself. So I think that it makes sense to question traditional ideas of masculinity and figure out which ones are helping and which ones are not helping. I also think it's important to bring up I think an aspect of toxic masculinity that imposes standards on other men. And I talked about this throughout the show already. And I bring this up because I had a guest on the show recently. His name is Lance. He is a pelvic floor physical therapist specialist. And when I asked him the question that I asked everybody on the show, which is, what do you think is the number one threat facing men? He said toxic masculinity. And because I think there are so many different ways that we think about toxic masculinity, I wanted to ask him, well, what are you talking about? And he said he explained it as the toxic masculinity as imposing standards on other men. So saying that, you're a man, so you're supposed to behave this way, or you're a woman, so you're supposed to behave this way. And I think that has been an answer to a lot of that has been an answer for me. That's been an answer to a lot of different quandaries presented. Is that we are being told how to behave. We are trying to behave in accordance with how people think we should be behaving, instead of doing it from our core, doing it from the values that are most important to us. And I think a relevant little analogy here to bring up is a book. It's from a book that I read called The Hypothesis of Happiness. And in this book, it goes into the benefits and the cons of both conservatism and progressivism. So the pros of conservatism are that there are established values, that there's less questioning, right? People are kind of on the same page with one another, that if they value the same thing, if they are behaving in the same way, then there's less confusion. Of course, the con of this is that there are a lot of people who don't want to behave in this particular way. And this year and every year since, we have gotten more and more to realize that, hey, there are a lot of people who don't fit this norm. And in order for them to be happy, we need to expand these ideas of acceptable behaviors. So, for these people, obviously the conservative mentality is not going to be helpful because it doesn't account for what they want. On the other hand, progressivism is great because it gives people more freedom. There are less established norms, right? You can figure out for yourself what's important and how you want to behave. The drawback there is that there is more confusion. It's moving more toward it's more in the direction of anarchy. And I'm not saying that, like, okay, if we let people behave how they want to behave, then we're going to have like a total shutdown of government. And that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there are different spectrums, and that's the one where that's leaning toward. But I guess if you want to think about conservatism, then that's leaning toward autocracy, right? Where that's leaning toward a dictatorship. So these are just the two different spectrums, and I think it's important to consider the pros and the cons of both. The author is liberal, and he talks about that, but I think he does a pretty good job of neutrally assessing both of these point of views. Um, I'm watching a show right now called Ted Lasso. If you're a Ted Lasso fan, it's an amazing show. It's super inspirational, and there's this amazing scene where he's in a pub and he's having a darts match with the bad guy in the show, and he doesn't know that he's a great darts player. He like kind of hustles him a little bit, and he's about to score the winning point, and he says, "Be curious, not judgmental." And the idea there is to be curious about what other people are thinking, not being judgeful, not make assumptions, but to be curious, to recognize that you don't have it all figured out, and to try and figure out, where are these other people coming from? What are they thinking? And I think that's a really good mentality to approach these things with, to be able to critically think, to be able to, realize, am I judging this person? Am I making an assumption, or do I really understand where they're coming from? So one other concept I did want to explore before I wrap things up is is there a better way to think about masculine and feminine behaviors? Because we talked about this earlier, but obviously there are there men and women are going to both do masculine and feminine behaviors, right? There, a man is not only going to be masculine, and a woman is not only going to be feminine. So the other ways that I've heard this described is the sea versus the ship. So this is a podcast interview I did a couple weeks ago. It's not going to be live for a couple more months now, but we explored this idea of the sea versus the ship. Right, the sea is chaos. The sea is uncontrollable. That is feminine, and the ship is what we control. This has direction, right, and that's masculine. Or we can think about yin and yang, right? Yin is, if you think about yin yoga, right? Yin is the softer yoga. Yin is restorative. Yin is more emotional, right? So that's feminine. But the yang is stronger. That's more of a physical, more physical. That's more intense. So that would be considered the masculine. So it might make sense it might make more sense to evaluate behaviors in this way, yin and yang and sea and ship, instead of saying, oh, that belongs to feminine or that belongs to masculine. Or if we don't want to change masculine and feminine, then understanding that masculine and feminine does not equate to male and female, but it's just you could think about it. If you think about a very masculine man, if you think about a biological man who's very masculine, then for him, masculine behaviors are going to be easier. And if you think about a very feminine woman, then for her, those feminine behaviors might come easier. Doesn't mean that they can't do both of those things, but it might mean that one is easier for them, or that they will be happier if they engage in behaviors that resonate with them more. But again, we're not imposing this on other people. This is a question for yourself. And if you identify as more feminine, or if you identify as more masculine, then it could be helpful to test out, maybe if I am more masculine, I'm going to be happier. Maybe if I do more masculine behaviors, I'm going to be happier. Or maybe if I live my life in a way that has more femininity, then maybe I will be happier by doing this. And you could be a man and have more feminine behaviors and be happier. You could be a woman and be more masculine and also be happier. It's up to you to figure out what is going to work for you. We're not imposing that on others. And for me, I bring this up because I do care about being a better man. I do care about being masculine. I think that I will be happier if I if I if I skew my behavior in a way that's masculine. I think that isn't deeper in alignment with who I am, and so that's why I'm interested in this. But if that doesn't apply to you, then you don't have to do that, and we're not imposing that on other people. We're figuring out for ourselves what is helpful, and how can I live in a way that's more in accordance with my own values. So that's kind of all I had on that. I think this could be a topic that could be explored endlessly. I don't think that there's a correct answer. I think it's just presenting different ideas, and figuring out which ones resonate for you. And then again, not imposing those standards on other people. Ryan Holiday has this great. I follow Ryan Holiday. I'm a big fan of reading Stoicism, and he has this one quote, or he brings this up a lot, but it basically says, we don't have time to judge other people. We don't have time to hold other people to certain standards, because we are already so busy with holding ourselves to our own standards, right? So for me, it makes sense because, like, all the things that I do in the day, all of the willpower that I have, all the energy that I have, it takes a lot of willpower and energy to be able to evaluate myself, to be able to monitor myself, to be able to behave in the way that makes me happy, that makes me content and fulfilled at the end of the day, that I don't have time to evaluate other people. I don't have time to hold them to standards. So I think that's a good thing to mention in this. Again, these are standards that you set for yourself. We're not imposing them on others. So you stuck around the whole time, guys. I appreciate you. I hope you got something out of this this solo discussion. Next up on the solo podcast for the Better Man podcast, I'm going to be talking about some strategies to getting results from your workout programs, specifically some mentalities and some information, some strategies that I think you should be embracing if you want to be more successful, if you want to be more consistent, if you want to get better results from your workouts. And that's something that has been very important to me over the years, and I'm excited to share that. So guys, thanks for listening to this solo podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. If you haven't already, please consider leaving a review on Apple Podcast or on Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you haven't started Manflow Yoga yet, we have an awesome brand new Getting Started series that is going to help you, walk you through getting started step by step, get you on a program, follow a path, and guide you through a series of workouts, a series of schedules of workouts that's going to help you get results, learn the postures, learn how to do yoga in a way that's strength and mobility focused, and really start feeling those results pretty quickly. So you can learn more about that and sign up at mfy.tv/join. All right, guys, thanks for joining. I'll see you on the next one. If you like that episode, check out this other one right here. I think you're really going to enjoy it. If you haven't subscribed, click this subscribe button over here, and you can listen to the full episodes on any major podcasting platform. Full details below in the description.